Hi, it's Jonathan Schwab. I host Jewish History Nerds with my friend Yael Steiner.
We're back. Every week, we nerd out on a fascinating topic from Jewish history. We're not historians, but we are fired up about learning. On Jewish History Nerds, we share our passion for Jewish history with each other and with you.
This season, we're exploring some of the most famous Jewish thinkers and intellectuals in history. You probably know their names, but we'll tell you their stories from their early days, and we'll get to know their backgrounds and beliefs. And as always, we have rich and captivating stories from Jewish history that you've probably never heard of. So join us for new episodes every Thursday. I promise you'll learn something new.
Subscribe to Jewish History Nerds wherever you get your podcasts. And now you can watch our videos on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search for Unpacked Podcasts. Whoever said history was boring clearly never heard these stories.
Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and this is Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This episode is sponsored by Friedkin Philanthropies and the Koret Foundation and is inspired by Israel 21C. To sponsor an episode of Unpacking Israeli History, or just to send me a note, be in touch at noam@unpacked.media. Before we start, as always, check us out on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all the places. Just search Unpacking Israeli History and hit the follow or subscribe button. Okay? Yalla. Let's do this.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
We, the people of Israel, are prepared and anxious to meet the representatives of our neighbors without any preconditions.
There are people in Israel and elsewhere say it's impossible to make peace between the Arabs and Israel or the Jewish people. I think they are wrong.
Welcome back to our two-part series on Israel and humanitarian aid, which is really a story of Israel's civil society as seen through its most prominent aid NGO, IsraAid. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, well, you should. Notable chapters include the story of Golda Meir's wild adventures across Africa and a heart-pounding tale of an Israeli NGO coordinating the evacuation of the Afghan women's cycling team as the Taliban closed in. Like, insane. Also, there's a decent amount of history in there about early Israeli foreign policy and diplomacy, featuring a cameo from everyone's favorite possible cannibal, Idi Amin Dada. But a week is a long time, so in case you're like, hey, Noam, sounds good, but I come to this podcast for the hard-hitting historical deep dives, your silly anecdotes, and, of course, references to 90s basketball, always surrounding Michael Jordan. So why are you suddenly talking to me about a random Israeli NGO? Well, I opened last week's episode explaining why our team decided to tell the story of IsraAid. And I'm going to open this week with a similar reflection. Historically, there are 5 approaches you can take when you talk about Israel and the diaspora. And some of these will sound familiar to you, but listen to these. Approach number 1 is being an advocate. You train people to defend Israel at all costs. Defend, defend, defend. When that approach fails, call people anti-Semites. Okay, I'm kidding. Mostly. Okay, approach number 2, do the exact opposite. Win internet points and make friends at the Columbia encampments by getting in there and making it about Israel no matter what. A Jewish person on Instagram is making a challah. Great. Comment, free Palestine. The U.S. collapses. The dictator of Venezuela. Perfect opportunity to tweet something about Zionists. For bonus points, bring up debunked or mostly inaccurate tropes like Israel sterilizes Ethiopian women and Israel erased Arab Jewish culture because it's an inherently colonial supremacist project. Okay, so those are approaches 1 and 2. Let's go to approach 3. Approach 3 is what's called Israel studies. Critically analyze the place. Read primary sources. Be analytical. I don't know how possible it is to be objective, but be fair. Review primary sources. Honestly, the way the best university courses are and really should be. Approach number 4, Israel education. Sounds like approach number 3, but a little different because education doesn't require you to be fully objective. Be informed because you care, because Israel is a part of your story, of your identity, of your world. You're not responsible for its actions. You're responsible for understanding as much as you can and staying informed and seeing how you make sense of your identity as a result of your engagement with it. Finally, approach number 5, branding. This one is closely related to approach number 1, defend, defend, defend. But this time, do it by showing off how awesome Israel is. Did you know Israelis invented Waze and the cherry tomato? Needless to say, I just like most of these approaches. Number one is boring. I'm not Israel's bodyguard, and I'm not going to put myself on the hook for actions or policies I don't agree with. I'm a human being, and I'm not an automaton. I get the impulse to defend fully, defend when you're under attack, but it's often not helpful, it's often not productive, and it's often not effective. Seriously. So, sorry to my keyboard warrior friends out there. And maybe, by the way, I feel like I'm insulting some of you. And that's, I love my family, and I make fun of my family for something like this also. But this approach has to seriously be considered before engaging with it. Again, I understand the impulse. It's just not educational. You can probably guess how I feel about approach number 2. Not my jam. Approaches number 3 and 4 are the most natural to me. I do my best to be objective in certain contexts. In others, I'm loud and proud. I'm American, but I'm Jewish. And that means that Israel is an inextricable part of my history and my identity. We have an epic 5-part series coming out that will explain why that is, by the way. Seriously, it's epic. It really is. I'm talking starts with Abraham, ends in 2026, looks into the future, kind of epic. Approach number 5, like approach number 1, doesn't interest me. If I was so interested in PR, I would be at like a PR firm, not a Jewish education nonprofit, and hosting a history podcast. So our team was very intentional when we sat down to write and rewrite these 2 episodes, because I'm not interested in putting a glossy spin on Israel, but it's kind of hard to avoid when you're talking about an Israeli aid NGO that does objectively amazing work. So why are we telling this story at all? Because IsraAid is not the government. It's an organization founded, staffed, run, and represented by members of Israeli civil society. Normal people with limited power or influence. Human beings trying to help other human beings without the diplomatic or geopolitical considerations that can hamstring a state institution. That's what allows the IsraAid team to set up aid networks in countries that have zero relationship to the Jewish state. For 22 years, IsraAid workers set up shop in places like Kenya, Haiti, and Japan. Thousands of miles from home, they worked hand in hand with local partners to mitigate disasters, both natural and man-made. They never expected to work within their own borders, let alone in Palestinian territory. But October 7th changed that along with so much else. And today, I'm going to tell you the story of how IsraAid began operating in 2 places they never expected. First, the idyllic kibbutzim that on October 6th were described as heaven on earth. And then as the war dragged, the team entered a far less obvious, far more controversial disaster zone, Gaza. But on October 6th, IsraAid's Israeli staff had no idea they'd be headed to Gaza in a matter of months, and they certainly didn't anticipate responding to a disaster within their own borders. Chapter 1, When Heaven Becomes Hell. In early October of 2023, IsraAid's most pressing concern was Morocco. Less than a month before, the most violent recorded earthquake in Morocco's history devastated the Al-Hawz province, home to the historic city of Marrakesh. Nearly 3,000 people died. Thousands more were injured and 500,000 displaced. Less than 48 hours later, IsraAid was on the ground, and only a few weeks after that, news began trickling in that something was very, very wrong back home.
We were all shocked by what's happened. It was obviously very personal for all of us, as I know it was for many people in the U.S. Thankfully, I didn't lose anyone from my family, but I lost a woman who was my mentor 15 years earlier, a woman called Vivian Silver that was a peace activist, and she inspired me to do this work.
We've talked about Vivian Silver before. She was the Canadian-Israeli peace activist who spent her spare time driving Gazans into Israel for medical care through an organization called Road to Recovery. Hamas burned her alive in her home. It took 5 weeks to identify her remains. There are many ways that humans respond to crises. Some freeze, some despair, and some leap into action. By the morning of October 8th, Israeli society had mobilized, including IsraAid.
On October the 8th, we launched one of our largest emergency responses to date in Israel at home.
The border was still on fire. Terrorists still hiding among the ruins of the communities they had taken over. The death toll was climbing, 500, 800, 900. Israelis had not yet even begun to grapple with the scale of the devastation. Desperate families trawled social media for a glimpse of their loved ones, not knowing what to hope for. Is it preferable to watch, helpless, as your terrified child is dragged into Gaza by the hair, or to see their body destroyed and bloody and take comfort in the fact that at least you know where they are? At least they are no longer suffering. And then there were the families with no answers at all. No nightmare reels of them being frog-marched into Gaza, pinned between laughing terrorists. No body, no eyewitnesses. In those first early days, countless families were tortured by hope. Hope that their loved ones were merely hiding still. That they'd taken refuge in a ditch or something, maybe mildly injured, unable to run for help, but gloriously alive. As the days ticked by, as the scientists at Abu Kabir Forensic Institute began identifying fragments that had once been human bodies, that hope dimmed. Meanwhile, 22 communities along the southern border were smoldering, bullet-pocked, traumatized, so there was no question of going down south. And as Hezbollah rockets began pummeling the north, the borders of the Jewish state seemed to shrink. 3% of Israel's population was now displaced. 300,000 people converging in the middle of a country that measures 290 miles from top to bottom. Without another alternative, the state sent them to the hotels and resorts that stud the alien coast of the Dead Sea. IsraAid followed, and they found a deeply traumatized population in a state of severe shock. Some had seen relatives killed or kidnapped as they screamed for someone to save them. Others hid in their safe rooms for hours without food or water or electricity as their phones dinged with increasingly dire messages. Just 48 hours prior, they had been normal. They had homes. They had communities. They had a formidable intelligence service, or so they thought, a $1 billion security fence, an army that ostensibly would protect them. But now those homes were gone. Those communities were blasted apart, a quarter of their residents killed or kidnapped. And the trust they had placed in the state, in the fence, in the army, that was shattered too. And the people who showed up to help them, government officials, private citizens, IDF, NGOs like IsraAid and Brothers in Arms, they weren't dispassionate aid workers with no personal stake in the tragedy. They were fellow Israelis, similarly shocked, traumatized, and grieving. Aid workers often form personal connections with the communities they serve, especially if they're on the ground for a long time. But this was different. This was the home front that was under attack. This was more than a personal connection. This is like a doctor performing surgery on a relative. But there was no time to dwell on the scale of the loss. Instead, the organization took charge of 16 evacuation sites housing refugees from the south. Government authorities provided basic shelter and meals. IsraAid and a coalition of volunteer groups took care of the rest. They set up makeshift schools so that children could have a routine again, even if it was just in a tent on a hotel lawn. They organized psychosocial support and trauma counseling for parents and kids alike, establishing child-friendly spaces, as they were called, where kids could play and process what they'd been through. They trained local volunteers in psychological first aid and in self-care, knowing that the helpers often needed healing too. They had done all this before in 64 different countries. The mechanics of it weren't different. The emotions were. The work provided a momentary respite from the grief. When the survivors of Kibbutz Be'eri told IsraAid they wanted to start a school for their kids, the IsraAid team jumped right in, happy to offer a concrete solution to people who had lost everything.
They wanted some sense of stability for the kids and for their parents. And it took us less than a day, and we built a school for them. We put a tent, we put tables, chairs, we recruited teachers because some of the teachers were murdered, some were kidnapped, and we operated a school for a year.
It's almost impossible to comprehend, even for me, and I was there. I visited Israel a month after the 7th of October. I told you about it at the time, about the kids I met, the Mefunim, or the evacuees, putting on a brave face despite everything. Imagine being a student in this makeshift school. Imagine looking around at a half-empty classroom, counting all the absences. The teachers and classmates now killed or abducted. This is the image that breaks me. Not the smoldering ruins of the kibbutzim, not the footage of atrocities, not even the photos of the victims, all of them beautiful and smiling, all of them completely unaware of how their lives would end. A bunch of kids sitting around a makeshift desk, play acting at normalcy, with a quarter of their classmates gone. I remember kicking around a soccer ball with some of these teenage Mefunim outside these makeshift schools, chatting with them, trying not to show them how much their bravery and empathy and pain broke my heart. That is the image that sticks with me. Meanwhile, the IsraAid team had no patience for red tape. If something needed to be done, they just did it. No asking for permission or waiting for forms to clear. The government was hamstrung by red tape and distracted by the Seven Front War, and I get that. So it was IsraAid that organized healing retreats for Nova survivors, and it was IsraAid that built bomb shelters in Bedouin communities. Once hundreds of thousands of Bedouin, a catch-all term for nomadic Arab tribes, roamed the Sinai and the Negev. Today, however, Israel's 300,000 Bedouin are no longer nomadic, but sedentary. The vast majority live in the Negev desert, scattered among government-built towns and smaller, mostly unrecognized villages. We really need to do an episode on the Bedouin one day, but for our purposes for this episode, the primary thing to know is that they have a complicated relationship to the state. Though they're citizens and some serve in the army, they have traditionally been neglected by the state. The government built towns for them without any real planning or infrastructure. As late as 2002, the majority of homes in government-built areas lacked indoor plumbing. Almost 25 years later, these towns have paved roads and running water and even a railway station. What they don't have, however, are sufficient bomb shelters. As you might remember from our Gulf War episode, Israel passed a law in 1992 dictating, by the way, there's no way that you actually remember this from the Gulf War episode, but I'm just giving you benefit of the doubt, if that's okay. But in 1992, they passed a law dictating that every building has a bomb shelter. That's the law. In particularly vulnerable towns like Sderot, there's a bomb shelter in every corner. The Bedouin communities of the Negev are equally vulnerable, but the state did not invest in their communities. The vast majority of homes lack shelters, and though there are some public shelters in Bedouin towns, there aren't nearly enough. It's one thing for the government to ignore the 35 unrecognized villages of the Negev. It's another to neglect the citizens who live in government-built towns, especially when the state faces its first serious aerial threat in 30 years. The last time Israelis were vulnerable to the missiles of an enemy country, Saddam Hussein was in power. But in April of 2024, Israel's archenemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran, made its move. For decades, the two countries, specifically the government of Iran, against the state of Israel, were fighting a shadow war. April 13th, 2024, Iran finally stepped out of the shadows, pummeling Israel with hundreds of drones and missiles. Most were downed by Arrow 3 or David Sling, the sci-fi-esque counterparts of the better-known Iron Dome. Some were intercepted by allies, but some fell within Israel. Hours into the attack, at 2 a.m., shrapnel from an Iranian missile directly hit a home in one of the 35 unrecognized Bedouin villages that dot the Negev, injuring 8 people and leaving a little girl in critical condition. After nearly a year in the hospital, the little girl finally came home. By then, her town and many others finally had bomb shelters, courtesy of IsraAid.
We did things that I never thought we will do. We ended up becoming like a construction company.
By late 2024, many of the displaced started to regain a sense of stability. Schools reopened. Refugees from both the north and the south returned to their homes. Bedouin communities now had bomb shelters, some built by relief organizations, others by the government. Israel was still at war, but the fighting had taken a turn. Most Hamas and Hezbollah leaders were dead. Israeli jets had destroyed most of Iran's air defenses, and a series of stunning operations, including the now famous Grim Beeper, significantly boosted Israeli morale. Next door, however, things weren't looking so good. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most controversial and provocative chapter of our story. Chapter 2, The Crisis Next Door. As the war dragged on, 2 million Gazans faced increasingly dire conditions. Everything was in short supply: water, food, medicine, electricity. Hospitals overflowed, infrastructure collapsed, and some 90% of the population lost their homes. Life under Hamas had never been a cakewalk. But no Israeli NGO was crazy enough to get into the humanitarian relief game in Gaza, IsraAid included. So when the war began, the team didn't even consider going next door.
Quite frankly, I didn't think we can get involved because we are Israelis. We can't operate in Gaza.
But in March of 2024, the phone started ringing and ringing and ringing, and the callers were not who you might expect.
We started to receive a lot of requests from humanitarian organizations and also from the IDF. They told us, guys, you are the only organization that understands both sides. You understand Israel's security concerns and you understand the humanitarian needs. And you need to build a bridge. You need to help us facilitate aid and making sure the aid reach the people and not Hamas.
IsraAid had always been apolitical, a relief organization divorced from government agendas. But that wouldn't matter to Hamas or to their sympathizers. There was no way IsraAid could enter Gaza if the population there knew who they really were. And then, as the team considered their next steps, yet another tragedy struck.
On April 1st of 2024, when there was the terrible, terrible incident of the World Central Kitchen, 7 of their staff was accidentally and tragically killed by the IDF. And 3 of them are people that I knew, that we worked with in other countries. I think that, to me, was the moment that I realized, okay, we have to do much more. We have to step in. We have an important role to play to make sure aid is reaching the civilian in Gaza, to leverage our unique positioning as Israeli organization, and to build these bridges in order to save lives.
They scrubbed the logos from their trucks and their uniforms. They took a deep breath. And then an Israeli team entered Gaza, not to wage war, not to gather intelligence, not to rescue hostages, but to help the 2 million people who needed it, even if they were technically the enemy. Initially, they served only as facilitators, liaising between big international NGOs and the Israeli government to cut through red tape. Gaza's needs were immense, but the pipeline of aid was snarled by mutual distrust. Aid groups complained Israel was blocking or delaying supplies. Israel shot back that aid was falling into Hamas's hands. It was a mess. Like a mess. Yotam and his team began cleaning this mess up. Behind closed doors, IsraAid coordinated closely with the Israeli government, something they had never done before. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and the target was clear. Help the civilians. That's it. At first, they helped other international NGOs deal with Israeli red tape. Security checks, permit forms, and the maze that is Kogat, aka the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, the Israeli government body that oversees civilian policy in the West Bank and coordinates between Israel and Gaza. If you've ever been to an Israeli post office, and I don't recommend you go to one, sorry to take shots, you already know that Israeli bureaucracy is a Kafkaesque nightmare that slowly drains any goodwill one might have towards the government. That's only like 10% a joke, at best. It's hard enough dealing with the authorities for normal, boring matters. Now imagine being the director of an international aid organization with no knowledge of Israeli culture, no Hebrew, and a pretty unsympathetic attitude towards Israelis, maybe even Jews, to begin with. It's a recipe for getting nothing done. So IsraAid took on the role of interpreter and advocate. An aid organization would call and say, we have a truck of medical supplies stuck at the border, or we need approval to bring in surgeons, and Yotam's team would take it from there.
And we became sort of the bridge between them and the IDF and the Israeli authorities. And the idea was to solve problems. So if an organization wanted to send doctors, or wanted to send water desalination, or wanted to do custom clearance, or wanted to send food, we wanted to make sure that they're trusted and vetted. And once we made sure that they are approved by the Israeli authorities, we helped them with everything they needed, from custom clearance to getting the permits, to getting the warehouse, the trucking, everything they needed on the Israeli side. We even procured for them, whether it's medicine or food.
But as the war ground on, IsraAid began taking on a greater role. The Israeli government had begun allowing aid organizations to purchase humanitarian goods from Israeli suppliers. Before, all aid suppliers had to come via Egypt or the UN. But now that critically needed goods could be sourced directly in Israel, IsraAid scaled up operations. They coordinated truck convoys, helped establish supply warehouses near the border, and even launched 2 major projects inside Gaza focusing on healthcare and clean water. As Gaza's medical system collapsed, IsraAid quietly launched a program to bring in non-Israeli surgeons from a nearby country to perform life-saving operations inside Gaza. IsraAid covered the costs and prepared these medical teams with trauma training before they set foot in a Gaza hospital, knowing full well what kind of devastation they'd be walking into. When Gaza's water system crumbled, IsraAid teamed up with a local partner on the ground to deliver truckloads of safe drinking water and install emergency desalination systems. The logistics were mind-bending. Israeli water experts were literally coaching Gazan engineers over Zoom, talking them through how to purify water in the middle of an active war zone. By mid-year, that collaboration was providing clean drinking water to 7,000 people every single day. And I'm sorry, I just need to stop and harp on this because I'm inspired. Is this not incredible? Is it not? I think it's pretty wild of IsraAid. Of course, all of this was kept completely under wraps. It kind of makes sense. In Gaza, even the perception of collaboration with an Israeli organization could be a death sentence. So IsraAid kept a low profile. No press releases, no public credit. The doctors and engineers on the ground knew they had support, but most of the Gazans receiving water or care had no idea an Israeli team was behind it. Again, this is wild. No? It's wild. By mid-2024, however, Yotam decided he had to go public about what his team was doing in Gaza. The situation there was just too dire, and he needed to rally more support and cooperation. And so Yotam gave a series of interviews carefully describing IsraAid's Gaza operation. His pitch was simple.
What we are focusing now is alleviating suffering and saving lives. And that's what I think everyone should be focusing on right now. The security concerns of Israel are real. We've seen how real they are on October 7th, and we continue to see how real they are every day. But also the humanitarian concerns are real. And the need to support the population, the civilian population in Gaza, is real. So it goes back to this challenge. And I think if we all remind ourselves that these two challenges are real and we need to find a way to balance these two, everything would look much better.
It's hard to overstate how unprecedented this really is. Gaza has long been a political minefield for aid groups. Many international NGOs are wary of being seen as taking sides. On the flip side, Israeli officials eye humanitarian groups with suspicion, fearing they'll funnel aid to Hamas or slam Israel with one-sided criticism, which left IsraAid walking a rather precarious tightrope. But the team had decades of experience working under terrible conditions, and they were not going to get caught up in politics when people were dying.
We understand that the only way forward right now is for everyone to work together, for the humanitarian organization to work together with the Israeli authorities, because that's the only way they can deliver aid right now, and they can make sure it's monitored and supervised. So for an organization who wants to play politics, wants to play the blame game, we are not part of this game. We are part of delivering aid to people.
Those politics, by the way, weren't just limited to the government that was actually waging the war. Israeli hostages were still chained up in Gaza's tunnels. Israeli citizens were still homeless and traumatized, and Yotam understood very well that the hardest hit Israeli communities might not be that appreciative about an Israeli organization providing aid to people who had cheered and celebrated as Hamas paraded both living and dead hostages through the streets.
When we started this work in Gaza, I was very worried on what the communities who were massacred on October 7 would think. So I actually went and spoke to each and every one of them, to the community leaders. And they were all actually very positive and appreciative.
In fact, Yotam recalls one kibbutz leader telling him that IsraAid's decision to help Gazans was
the most hopeful thing she heard since October 7. The fact that we are working in Gaza, because she knows that we're not only about the humanitarian needs, we also are worried and concerned and are focused on her long-term security and stability and the communities in Israel.
Of course, the hard-hit border kibbutzim were generally, though not always, pretty left-coded. The border kibbutzim were home to a disproportionate share of your classic, old-school Israeli lefty type, the sorts of people who organized peace festivals and profoundly valued coexistence. They are a fast-shrinking minority in Israel, especially in the wake of the 7th of October, so I don't want to paint a false picture for you. There were absolutely Israelis who saw any aid to Gaza as a form of betrayal. But most Israelis, even hardliners, had other things to worry about, like the hostages coming home, the war ending, the fight over the draft, the punishing schedule of reservists who had already spent the better part of a year on the front lines instead of with their families. Meanwhile, in Gaza, most civilians have no idea that IsraAid has any involvement in the relief effort. But local Gazan aid workers do, and Yotam says they've been extremely grateful for the assistance.
I'm getting a lot of very, very heartwarming messages from them. This is not why we're doing it, of course. And still the level of desperation is so high, so there's so much more to do.
Still, Yotam estimates that IsraAid's efforts have reached around 200,000 Gazans with essentials like tents, food, water, and medical care. They were even quietly involved with some urgent evacuations. Of course, all of this requires money. And when you're an NGO that strives to stay as apolitical as possible, that means canvassing donors. North American Jews are among IsraAid's most generous benefactors, but the team wasn't sure how they would react to the operations in Gaza. Very generously, it turns out, in a pretty incredible, and I'm using that word really descriptively, in a pretty incredible moment, August 2025, synagogues and federations from all over North America gave millions to support IsraAid's operations in Gaza. IsraAid, by virtue of being Israeli and humanitarian, gave Jewish donors a way to help.
We are inviting everyone, individuals, organizations, partners to join us in this effort, because we believe that we really need to show the world that Israel needs to be part of the solution, needs to be even leading the solution, not just in the immediate relief, but also in the day after. I know it's very difficult psychologically, but I think that's sort of the biggest realization for us. We can't neglect it.
It's not a particularly popular opinion these days, especially in the world of humanitarian relief, but it's a necessary perspective. Both Israelis and Palestinians need to be part of whatever comes next. Pretending otherwise is counterproductive. And though IsraAid did not set out to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or to represent Israel or to engage in any kind of diplomacy, the team is highly conscious of the fact that they built bridges in highly unlikely places, that their good work can bring goodwill, not because that's their ultimate goal, not because they expect or demand it, but because doing good, visibly and consistently, can often generate goodwill. Goodness often breeds goodness, the best product I can imagine. And that's why Yotam has steadfastly refused to take Israel out of IsraAid's name, despite potential backlash. And if you were wondering that same thing that I was wondering, now we know why. It is Israel's traumas, the poverty of the early years, the wars, the lack of natural resources, the rapid absorption of vastly different groups of immigrants that have made the country and IsraAid so uniquely placed to help others, no matter who or where they are. So that's the surprising and powerful story of IsraAid, and here are your 5 fast facts. Number 1, as newborn Israel looked for allies, David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir decided that providing humanitarian aid to developing countries was as good a strategy as any. Number 2, sometimes that strategy blew up spectacularly, like when Idi Amin Dada of Uganda turned on Israel, cozying up to its enemies instead. Number 3, still, the foreign ministry kept trying because the Jewish state was uniquely placed to offer hard-won know-how in the fields of trauma care, agriculture, and disaster response. Number 4, the foreign ministry wasn't the only player in the game, however. NGOs like IsraAid are entirely apolitical, which allows them to do things that governments cannot, including entering countries that have no relationship to Israel. And number 5, in the course of their work, IsraAid has managed to build bridges with Afghans, with Syrians, with Gazans, and so many more. Those are your 5 fast facts, but here's one enduring lesson as I see it. We talk a lot about bigwigs on this podcast, movers, shakers, headlines, and history books. Some of these people are my personal heroes, even if they're not perfect, like Menachem Begin. Others are basically irredeemable. Shout out to Haj Amin al-Husseini. But the vast majority are way more complicated than that. Just people trying to do the best job they could while stumbling around in the dark, not knowing how the story would end, how their efforts would turn out. Your David Ben-Gurions, your Golda Meirs, your Yitzhak Rabins. But these world builders, these pioneers, they dedicated their lives to building something, to creating a home for the next generation, and the one after that, and the one after that. Their greatest dream was for ordinary Jews to live as ordinary people in an ordinary place. And though I'm not convinced ordinary is a word that can or will or should ever be applied to Israel, I get the impulse. These firebrands were building a country in the hopes that one day there would be a Yotam or Tal Brody, the American-Israeli basketball player who led Maccabi Tel Aviv to victory. They built a society so there would one day be a Yonit Levy, the news anchor for Israel's Channel 12, or an Omri Glickman, the lead singer of the band Hatikva 6. They couldn't imagine these people specifically. They didn't know their details, their specifics, but they were guided by an outline. One day, it will be the most normal thing in the world for a Jew to live a Jewish life in a Jewish country, whatever that means to them. That's why they built a country, so that Jews all over the world would have a safe place to be, and from there to contribute to the broader world, to take part in the dialogue and innovation and commerce between the family of nations, to spread light, to be the best versions of ourselves, to be the people God commanded us to be, whether or not we believe in said God, to change the world. And if we want to understand that country and its incredible mandate, we need to look to its civil society, not to its politicians, but to its ordinary Tamars and Sachis and Shachars who are writing the next chapter of Israeli history, not by entering into wars or signing treaties, but by doing the quiet, everyday work of building a better society, a better world, not because of branding, not out of hasbara, not because we've got something to prove, but because this is why the Jewish people exist. Because we have so much to contribute, so many ways to improve the world around us. Like Yotam and his team, most of them will never be famous. We'll never know their names. But that doesn't diminish their role in the story, the history of the modern state of Israel, of the Jewish people writ large. And it doesn't diminish ours either. You are a part of this story too, anonymous listener, whoever you are. Maybe not a part of the story of Israel, per se, unless you live there, but you're part of a story. My advice, my suggestion, my recommendation to you and to me, make your part in it count. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, an OpenDor Media brand. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend who you think might appreciate it, and then leave us a nice rating on Apple or Spotify, because it really does help other people find our podcast. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes Simon Apfel, Adi Elbaz, Ari Schlacht, and Rob Pera. Special thanks to Yotam Politzer and the entire IsraAid team for sharing so much of your time with us. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for being here. See you next week.